What does Joe Exotic have to do with data science? Is your neighbor keeping a tiger in their apartment? Is captivity equivalent to conservation? All of this and more on today's episode of The Secret Life of Numbers.
Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to find the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it comes from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Lavanya, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator. For when Lavanya gets too technical on us, I'll be breaking down the rest.
All right, let's jump in.
So this is a really exciting episode because it's actually the last episode of our first season.
Yes, I'm so glad that we've had the opportunity to do this project together, and a little sad that it's coming to an end. Well, at least the first season. There will be more seasons.
Yes, there may be a slight hiatus between season 1 and season 2 as we are working behind the scenes, but I think it's been such a fun project, and thank you to everyone who's been listening, or if this is your first episode, welcome. We hope you'll take a look at some of the other ones that we have.
Go back and listen to everything we've been saying.
But this episode in particular is one that I'm really excited about because I feel like it actually takes us back to around that time when we started the podcast, which was at the height of quarantine.
It was.
So, Lavanya, a very important question for you. What TV show did you binge during quarantine?
I don't think it was as popular as some of the others, but I binged The Great Canadian Baking Show. I watched all 3 seasons, and then I was just too committed, so I had to watch the holiday episode as well.
I love that. Aw, such a good show. So Canadian.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what more could you ask for? Butter, sugar, and decorative cakes.
Everything you need in a show. One of the shows that I binge watched during quarantine, which I think was pretty universal, was Tiger King. Which, as far as shows go, it was entertaining, but at times it got a little messy. But there was this one line from the show that really stuck out to me, and it was this stat that there are more tigers in captivity in the United States than in the wild globally. And that is our number for this episode, and it inspired us to look into where are the tigers, and is this number even true? Here to take us into all of the details of counting animals and also specifically tigers. Lavanya, ready?
I am. Why don't we start with some tiger basics first?
I like it.
Tigers are the largest feline in the world, and there are 9 subspecies. 3 of these subspecies of tigers are extinct, and the remaining 6 are endangered. Tigers live in Russia, China, Malaysia, Sumatra, and India, historically, although much of their original range has disappeared. There are many threats facing tigers, for example, habitat loss, declining numbers of prey, poaching by humans as well. And I'll also, because I talked a little bit about extinct and endangered, so I think I'll give a definition of those as well. So extinct happens when the last existing member of a species dies. So that species no longer exists. Or an endangered species is a type of organism that is threatened by extinction. So species can become endangered for many reasons. For example, loss of habitat, loss of genetic variation. They're not extinct yet, but they're in danger of becoming extinct.
Right. They're possibly on their way there.
Yes.
And hopefully they won't become extinct. When we come to counting tigers, that sounds like a pretty large task.
When you think about counting something, or really anything, you want to give it some order, right? Like, for example, in a lab, you might count cells on a grid, and you'll look at the blocks of the grid and count how many cells are in each block, and then move from block to block. But this really can't happen for you with tigers, right?
Yeah, tigers, unfortunately, for people counting, don't just sit still and wait for the researcher to count.
They don't pose for you and let you count them. So the way we count tigers is actually very different in the wild compared to in captivity. And these are like two umbrellas. So I think to explain it, we'll first start with how we would go about counting tigers in the wild, and then we'll move into captivity.
Sounds good. It's nice to break it up into those two camps.
So first, in our research, we did find a number of how many tigers are in the wild. So the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List, which is essentially a list of most species in the world that are known to science and their conservation status, they state that there are 2,154 to 3,159 mature tigers in the wild. Now the question is, how do we get there? How did we count them? We'll do a little bit of a SparkNotes version of conservation counting.
This could really be an entire university class.
Yes. We'll start simple. So the first way that you could count these tigers in the wild is complete counting. And like the name suggests, that means you just go and you would count every single tiger. But as you can guess, this is probably very costly. And also, you would probably destroy a lot of the natural habitat while you were doing it. So this is not generally a method that we use, or a popular method.
Yeah. I mean, tigers get a lot of conservation dollars because they're kind of cute and people really identify with them in a lot of ways, I think. But even tigers would have a hard time, I think, getting enough money to do a complete count and then be confident that you got every single tiger.
Exactly. After complete counts, we come to incomplete counts. So this is just counting a portion of your grid, for example, where tigers live, and then extrapolating that number to the rest of the grid.
Right.
So you're essentially sampling your area, counting the tigers, and then applying that number to the rest of the area.
So I guess with incomplete counts, you're assuming that that grid or that one kind of square of landscape, or if you're counting multiples, that is representative of the entire landscape or habitat area that tigers might be occupying.
Yes, because now all of those sampling things that we talked about in previous episodes now apply, because you need to make sure that your sample is representative of the total area.
Right. But I suppose from a feasibility standpoint, incomplete counts, it's a lot more attractive than complete counts.
Oh, for sure. Yes. I mean, certainly cheaper.
Yes.
Then we move into something called indirect counts. So this is counting tigers based on the signs that they leave behind, for example, like scat, which is their poop, or the presence of dens. But then in indirect counts, you have some assumptions that you need to make, because how much scat is equal to one tiger?
Right. And I guess you're also assuming that that's a constant relationship.
Exactly.
That it doesn't change. Maybe time of year, they're eating more greens because it's spring and there's more fiber in the diet. And so you're assuming that relationship is constant. Although I suppose you could determine the relationship for different, if there's seasonality with it, and run an analysis on that. But yeah, you see how those layers start to form.
Yeah, there's definitely some, I guess, assumptions that are worked into the counting when they run indirect counts, but you need to be aware of all of those things in order to remove them.
Right, or to manage them.
Yes. And then finally, we have mark recapture as a method of counting, and I believe this is probably the most popular counting method. The way this works is you capture the tigers, you mark them, you release them, and then you recapture, and you determine the ratio of marked to unmarked tigers. Then, given the amount of tigers you captured, plus the ratio, you can extrapolate to how many tigers are in your area.
Right. You have a trapping session where maybe you tag them as well so that you can look at movements later on for other studies or determine home range. But then you let them go and you do a second trapping session. And if all of the tigers that you caught have a mark or a tag on them already, you can feel quite confident that you got most of the tigers in the area, if not all. But if the reverse happens and none of the tigers you capture are marked, you're going to be assuming you're dealing with a lot more tigers than you previously expected to.
And there's also some assumptions as well that you need to make, right? Like, for example, mortality is the same in your marked population versus your unmarked population. There's no ingress or egress in your population.
You're assuming the tags stay on and that they aren't lost. And I guess you're also assuming that the tigers aren't trap happy, meaning they really like to be trapped and they'll come back to be trapped if they've already been trapped, or trap shy, meaning they won't be coming back.
Yes. There are, I think I read a paper where they were taking pictures of the tigers, and some of the tigers were actually afraid of the flash. So it was hard to recapture them.
Oh, the poor tigers. They're walking by and they're like, oh, that dang tree, it keeps flashing. There's actually also phenomenons, as I mentioned, where animals become trap happy. So maybe they like
They just pose for the camera?
Yeah, they give you a little smile and a wink.
Okay, so we talked about how we would count tigers in the wild. Let's move on to counting tigers in captivity. So Traffic, which is a wildlife trade monitoring network supported by the World Wildlife Fund, estimates that the two largest populations of tigers in the world are both in captivity in China and in the United States. And this report estimates 5,000 captive tigers in the United States as of 2008 and fewer than 2,500 breeding tigers in the wild. And 2,500 is actually within that range that we previously mentioned that was reported by the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List. So I think we've got a couple sources saying that the number of tigers in the wild is quite low compared to in captivity. So I think we have some confidence that this statement is true.
It's nice, too, that those ranges of numbers, too, given by the IUCN Red List and then also Traffic, overlap, right? So we're feeling a bit more confident in those numbers.
Yeah. Traffic goes on to say that they estimate the captive population in China is larger than in the United States due to the demand for tigers for Chinese medicine purposes.
Right. And in the United States, a lot of the demand really grew from a desire for big cat exhibits and exotic pets.
Yeah, exotic pets. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I found particularly striking about this report is that they went on to say that only 6% of the tigers in captivity are in accredited facilities. So if we're doing the math here, of those 5,000 captive tigers, 4,700 of them are living in non-accredited facilities under private ownership.
So I think that's really hard to visualize, right? What does a non-accredited facility look like? And I think for listeners out there who have watched Tiger King, there's an example of, it's not like we're going to the San Diego Zoo and we go to see Joe Exotic's tigers. There's an example of a non-accredited facility, and there were quite a few tigers on the property. Obviously not 4,700, so there's lots of other ones out there, but that would be an example of that private ownership.
I actually got a news article come across my feed about a tiger that was loose in Houston, Texas recently.
Oh, no. Wasn't it loose for a week before they found it?
Yes, that's what they said. The tiger's name was India.
Aw.
But I believe they recaptured it and it's going to a conservation area to live out the rest of its life.
So hopefully it's moving into the 6%.
So in captivity, the way we count tigers, I think the best way to describe this is it's really a case of count them when you need to or when you find them. Right? So when you need to count them is when they're in those accredited facilities. And then when you find them is when they're in non-accredited facilities.
Or if you find them illegally, like if there's wildlife trade going on.
The way that we count them in non-accredited facilities is something called chain of assumptions. So for example, the way this works, if 3 owners of tigers are apprehended in one Texas county and they each have 10 tigers, then we can assume 30 cats per county in the state and then extrapolate from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So with chains of assumptions, though, I guess at each time you're adding a new line of this many tigers, this many per county. and extrapolating by counties. Each time you add a new line, you're adding new assumptions. And if that number is off, particularly an early number, your estimation can go in a very different direction from reality.
It can become a sampling nightmare if you think about it, because your sample is really not random, because this is convenient sampling, right?
Yeah. And it's really a case, too, where there's not a lot you can do about moving away from convenient sampling to something more representative, because it is kind of an out of sight, out of mind. I don't think a lot of people really want to, unless they're making money and advertising that they have tigers, like making money off of that. I don't think they're really exactly calling people up and saying, hey, I've got some tigers. You want to come?
So you're absolutely right. At many levels, they're verifying these assumptions and they're checking to make sure that they haven't introduced bias, or that they're reducing the amount of bias that they're putting into these calculations when we're dealing with change of assumptions.
Which is really important. And there's actually some really cool examples of chains of assumptions in different areas of biology and conservation biology. Like there was one example I learned about in undergrad where we were trying to figure out the number of a certain type of bug in a tree. And you had all these assumptions of like, okay, if we go out and we shake the tree and we have a net and we catch all these bugs, like how many are the kind that we're looking for, how many aren't, and then we'll extrapolate to the rest of the tree, and then we'll extrapolate to all the trees, and then we'll assume that we like missed this number of bugs, and it keeps going, and it's kind of fun. That was a kind of a famous example of a chain of assumption, but
okay,
there's many different applications.
Obviously, seeing here that we're counting tigers in captivity.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about how tigers are counted both in the wild and in captivity. After the break, we're going to come back and talk about how we got here. How did all of these tigers end up in captivity?
Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we left you on a bit of a cliffhanger of how did we even get here? How did we end up with 4,700 tigers under private ownership in the United States?
I'm sure they were all eagerly awaiting for us to come back.
So one of the really interesting things about tigers in the United States is that they don't know anything different for the most part. They didn't, come here on a plane or a train. They were born here. And as a result, they can't really go back to where they came from. So essentially, like some tigers were smuggled into the United States, obviously, or some might have come here through legitimate means to be part of, the zoos, or been rescued for various reasons. But then there's really this demand for tiger cubs because it's really easy to sell an experience with tiger cubs.
So these are domestic tigers.
They're domestic in the sense that most of them were born here, but they're not domestic in the sense that they're a domesticated animal.
Okay. Yes. Because they still maintain some of their wildness.
Exactly. So they're still wild animals if, it's running around Houston, or I even read one report of a tiger that was being kept in a Bronx apartment, also with a python.
Oh, wow. I hope that was a large apartment.
I hope so, too. As I mentioned, a lot of tigers were born in the United States. And we also aren't 100% certain on how many there are, right? We have some rough estimates, but 5,000, for example, is a very round number.
Yes. There's definitely some error surrounding that number.
Exactly. And there's a lot of uncertainty about that number. And then there's also really this patchwork system of legislation around tiger ownership. And it's kind of a chicken and an egg phenomenon, right? Like, do we have loose legislation because no one thought they would ever have to tell people not to keep tigers as pets? Or do we have people keeping tigers as pets because the legislation isn't really there?
I feel like this is kind of like something that perhaps people just never thought about, right? They never thought, similar to Tide Pods, like you never thought you would have to tell teenagers not to eat them. You never thought you would have to tell people not to own a tiger illegally.
I think so. It's really strange, right? Like, why not get a kitten? There's kind of a lack of transparency and information about how many tigers there are in the United States and where they're living. So that keeps the problem really out of sight, out of mind. As a result, let's go over some of these loose laws that we have in the United States around tiger ownership.
Okay.
So only 14 states have laws that require private tiger owners to register their tigers. But as we all know, just because it's the law, it doesn't mean that everyone does it. So there's likely many tiger owners living in those states that also don't register.
Hmm.
And I also have the question of, where do you go to register your tiger?
That's an interesting question. And also, like, what type of training is required in order for you to own a tiger?
I'm going to go with probably none.
Well, I would hope that there'd at least be some, but
I think one of the purposes, too, for having this registration isn't necessarily to make sure that the people owning the tigers are well qualified to do so, but it helps giving us an idea of how many tigers are out there. Because under the Freedom of Information Act, you can get the numbers of how many tigers are registered, and then you can better understand the situation that you're dealing with. As I mentioned, there's only a few states that require tiger registration, but there's really a diffusion of responsibility across many major levels. As an example, there are a lot of exemptions and exceptions within the Animal Welfare Act and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with respect to captive bred wildlife. So much so that some facilities, even though they are part of that holding the 6% of tigers in accredited facilities, they don't even have to report their tiger inventory. So that means we might not actually know how many are in that 6%, even though they're supposedly a number that's a little bit more easy to track.
I guess, is there work in progress to make this legislation more robust?
So this actually brings us right back to Tiger King, because in the show, if y'all have watched it, you'll remember that Carol Baskin was lobbying for the Big Cat Public Safety Act. And for those not familiar with Tiger King, the bill would, quote, prohibit any person from breeding or possessing prohibited wildlife species, i.e. any species of lion, tiger, leopard, cheetah, jaguar, or cougar, or any hybrid of such species, end quote. Violating this bill would lead to up to a $20,000 fine and or up to 5 years in prison. This bill was supposed to be introduced to help protect those tigers that are possibly in those non-accredited facilities in private ownership that are at risk.
Yes, that are born here or born in the United States.
However, an issue is that it's kind of in bill purgatory. The latest update is that the bill was referred to the Subcommittee on Federal Lands, and not much has really come of it since. So I think what we're really seeing is this diffusion of responsibility. In the conservation world, we have some pieces of legislation that are fairly robust. So an example of that would be the United States Endangered Species Act of 1973, which the whole purpose of it is to protect endangered wildlife. But a key point to this is that it only applies to animals taken from the wild. And since the tigers here were born here.
Yes, they're like first-generation tigers.
Yeah, some second or third generation too by now and further along. And so, which means that this law doesn't really apply to them. So regulation then falls to the state level. And there are some laws, as we've seen with the 14 states with some registration. But an issue is that enforcement happens at the level of the county. We really have this trickle-down effect where people are ideally trying to do as much as they can within their wheelhouse, but the wheelhouses aren't connected.
And I guess it's also hard to get an idea of the scope from such a small lens as well.
Right. It's like what you said with the counting. Like, it's kind of, you don't deal with it until you have to.
Yeah. And also, that kind of seems like a lot to put on the county shoulders, like exotic pet legislation.
Yes. And the enforcement of it. Like, yes, we are going to have people at the county level, not that they aren't qualified at what they do, but dealing with big cats is a pretty big issue. And even further, there's so much that we could talk about the different laws, but one that I found particularly striking was that only 4 states ban breeding of privately held tigers. So that means that in 46 other states, you can breed the tigers that you have. So you can perpetuate the problem continuously. And there's nothing from a legal standpoint to stop you.
Yeah, I feel like this goes back to things that we just don't really think about. I suppose county governments didn't think that they would have to legislate tigers, let alone legislate breeding of tigers.
Yeah, it's just each time they're like, how did you take it one step further? I thought we were done. One thing I want to say is that we've had a bit of fun poking fun at tigers in the United States, and Tiger King is set in the United States. So it's kind of where most of our numbers have focused on. But unfortunately, big cats are also an issue here in Canada.
So do you have some numbers about big cats?
Would it be The Secret Life of Numbers if we didn't? So a 2019 survey estimates that there are 2,383 tigers being kept in Canada.
Okay, that's not nothing.
If we want to zoom out a little bit more, exotic pets in general are a big problem in Canada. There's an estimated 1.4 million exotic pets here in Canada, and around 588,652 of them live in Ontario.
Well, Lindsay, how many live in BC?
I really thought the number for Ontario was the most interesting, so that's the one that I chose to put in the report.
Okay. So is this also a result of legislation in Canada not being as robust as it should be?
We see kind of a microcosm of what we see in the United States.
Okay.
So different levels of government, we have different legislation around this. So at a federal level, permits are required for species that are threatened by the wildlife trade, which tigers would fall under. But then province to province is where we start to see a lot of variation.
All right.
So Ontario and the Northwest Territories have no provincial legislation or regulation about tiger ownership. So tigers can actually be legally owned as pets in the Northwest Territories. And then for Ontario, they delegate that responsibility of exotic pet ownership laws to municipalities, which again is a lot on city council to be dealing with.
Yeah, it feels like a pretty big responsibility.
Need new sidewalks. Also, some of our neighbors have tigers. What should we do about it?
Yeah.
Across the rest of the country, so BC and New Brunswick actually have slightly stronger laws, but they're not as strong as they could be. They're not the strongest we have in Canada, and they largely arose from incidents involving exotic pets. So specifically in BC, there was a tiger mauling in 2007, and then very unfortunately, quite recently in 2013, there was the death of the 2 young boys with a python that
Yes, I remember. Yeah, so I guess the legislation in Canada is really quite reactive, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's not as preventative. It's, oh no, this is an issue. These animals are here. What are we going to do about it? And as far as provinces go for legislation, do you want to guess which province is the most rigorous?
I think I want to go with Quebec.
It is actually not Quebec. It is Prince Edward Island.
Do you think it's because it's an island?
I think that might help. Like, they can just be like, oh, no tigers coming across Confederation Bridge.
Stop right there.
Where do you think you're going? So in Prince Edward Island, no wildlife can be kept as a pet without a license, whether the animal is wild or native. And then they also don't provide licenses for a lot of exotic and native animals.
So unlike in Ontario, where you can own a tiger, in PEI, they say no.
Yes, they're like, we're not doing that. And one of the things that I found interesting too about exotic pet ownership is we often think of the big names, right? So tigers or large snakes or lions. I think there's even a few elephants.
Wow. I mean, certainly those are the exotic pets that come to my mind.
But there's also other exotic pets, right? Like there's smaller reptiles, or some turtles, for example, have been an issue. And then there's also risks with zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that are transferred from COVID is a zoonotic disease, but it's transferred from an animal reservoir, basically where the microbe is harbored, to a human, for example. So with turtles, the issue is salmonella.
Okay.
So a few years ago, there was a string of news articles all about how you shouldn't kiss your pet turtle because they naturally have salmonella on them. Exotic pet ownership yes, it is the big animals, but it's also the smaller animals. And I think that's one where it doesn't seem as major.
Yeah, because they're smaller. I guess maybe they're out of sight truly and therefore out of mind.
I really think so.
All right, Lindsay, do you know what time it is?
I think I do.
It's time for our science seed. And this is our last one of the season, our last science nugget. Each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about, a science nugget to help them think more critically about the numbers, statistics, and really the science you hear every day. So, Lindsay, take it away.
Okay, so I don't think this one will necessarily come as a bit of a surprise because it's kind of been a theme that we have woven through the episode. But the real takeaway here is that captivity is not conservation. We talked a lot about exotic pet ownership, and I think with tigers especially, knowing that they are endangered in the wild, and some of the subspecies, as Lavanya mentioned in the start of the episode, are extinct, that it's a good thing that we have these animals being kept. And, it's unlikely that we'll see a total disappearance of tigers from the face of the earth because we do have these captive animals. But one of the issues is that the tigers kept in captivity can't ever be released to the wild. They become too adapted to human interaction, and they really lose their wildness to the degree that they're not going to be successful if we send them out there. Sometimes tigers in captivity, not always, but many times, are kept in confined spaces or spaces quite a bit smaller than what their traditional home range would be. And they're fed diets that aren't equivalent to what they'd be eating in the wild. And due to the demand for tiger kittens, as we mentioned, inbreeding can happen quite quickly. Captive tigers that are bred for conservation purposes to release into the wild, which is a whole branch of conservation biology called ex situ conservation. There's strict rules in science that goes behind what are we feeding the tigers, how are we feeding them, what people are able to go into where the tigers are.
Yeah, how many interactions with humans do they have?
Exactly, to maintain that wildness so that when they are released, the next time they see someone with a net and a tranquilizer gun, they're not going to become trap happy because they really like humans. Thank you so much for joining us for this first season of The Secret Life of Numbers. I think I can speak for both of us when I say that we had an absolute blast coming up with different episode topics, diving into the science behind it, and we hope that our listeners are leaving with a little bit more in their tool belt about different statistics, different numbers, different methods.
Agreed. And if you haven't listened to all of the episodes, I would, recommend that you go back and listen.
Yes, they are all there just waiting for you. So if this is your first one, there's 9 others this season to go enjoy.
Thanks for listening to our first season, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we use for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and original music.
Have an idea of what number we should cover in season 2? Do you want to learn more about what we've talked about this season? Follow us on Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers.
We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.